Hello, everybody. It's Ken from Global Renaissance TV. And wow. We're here in Plum Village in the south of France, near Bordeaux. It is a Zen community that we're at. And I'm here with my friend, Douglas MacRae. Douglas, welcome.
Howdy. Thanks.
So this is a rather interesting interview because it's, I suppose, the start of my series of interviews where I'll be interviewing Singaporeans who lead, shall we say, alternative lives. But I suppose, Doug, you don't think of yourself as a Singaporean, even though you were born in Singapore, right?
Yeah, born in Singapore and proud to be a Singaporean.
Do you have a Singaporean passport?
No. Well, actually, yeah. According to the Singapore government, I'm still a Singapore citizen. If you're born a Singapore citizen, you're always a Singapore citizen. There's no way. I thought when I was like 12 years old, I thought I'd given my Singapore passport back.
Mm-hmm.
But now, recently, I found that actually I'm still considered a Singapore citizen, and you're not allowed to give back your Singapore citizenship. You're always a Singaporean.
Did you serve military service?
No, and that's how I found out that I was still a Singapore citizen, because recently I wanted to go back and visit Singapore because my mother had decided, we were living in France, right, and
Mm-hmm.
my mother decided to go back to live in Malaysia, where she was born. And so me and my son, we were going to go with her, and visit Asia, Southeast Asia and stuff. And I thought I'd like to go back and see Singapore, this fantastic place that I've seen on TV, seen in the magazines. It's supposed to be this city which is like no other. It's like a green New York, like a clean Hong Kong,
Actually, Doug, let's back up a little bit here,
Yeah.
because the viewers are probably getting confused. Like,
Yeah.
why am I interviewing this guy?
Right.
So, first of all, I wanted to interview Doug because I think he's a very interesting person, and he in many ways, to me, as an overseas Singaporean, when I came over to Europe, shall we say, I began to meet all these Singaporeans who had lived very alternative lifestyles.
Really?
And just to summarize what I know of Doug, Doug at a very early age left Singapore. He used to be in Catholic high school, but then your Chinese wasn't good enough, and then he got booted out.
Yeah.
And that was the 50s.
The what?
What?
That was in 1980s. 1980.
1980.
1980. I was 12 years old at the time, and I wasn't the only one booted out. It was Catholic high school, so there were only Chinese boys there. And I remember there was about 300 of us brought into this kind of huge auditorium, and all told that we were useless, and there was no way we were going to make it through to the next year.
Mm-hmm.
We had to pull our socks up or get out,
Mm-hmm. And then you spent. I just want to summarize very briefly why I'm interviewing you.
All right.
And you spend a lot of time.
I spent 4 years in France at that point. Right. When we left Singapore, I was 12 years old. It was in 1980, and my dad hadn't made enough money in Singapore. And, he was into business. He'd set up his own company in Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
Was it offshore oil tanker repair business? And he'd done very well out of that. But that was all over. He'd made enough money, and he'd had enough. And he wanted to go back to Europe, where he was, because my dad is like Scottish, right?
Mm-hmm.
MacRae Smith. And so he saw his retirement. He'd been in Singapore and a bit in Hong Kong, but mainly in Singapore for years, 20 years or something like that, 30 years, don't know exactly. And he decided he wanted to go back to Europe, where he was born, right? Get closer to his roots. And they had bought this farm, this old farm in southwest France, Lot-et-Garonne. It's like between Toulouse and Bordeaux. In the middle of nowhere, countryside. And we used to go there for our holidays, right? I used to come to France, fly to France from Singapore. And we'd spend 6 months on this farm. And so he decided that he was going to go and move there and live there permanently on this farm in France in the middle of the countryside. Total opposite of Singapore, basically. No business, just countryside. And so I was given the choice seeing as at this time I was being booted out of Catholic high school as well, this seemed like a perfect point to, for the family to make a change. He'd stopped his business. I was in a kind of transition period at school. And so I was given a choice. He said, either you come to France with us, you learn French, and you go to school in France and live with us there, like a French kid, or you go to the other choice was being sent to his old school, public school which is actually private school, of course, public school in England, his old school, Cranley. So I could either go and live at school in England or live with them in France, right? And for me, in my mind, I was a very kind of confident, adventurous kind of child in those days, right?
This is you at 16?
No, 12 years old. 12 years old, full of confidence, good family. My parents loved me. I was the only child, brought up, spoilt, and all the rest of it, and full of confidence. No difficulties in life, and I wanted adventure. And so going to Europe, I thought to myself, well, I've got a British passport because I was born in Singapore, had the Singapore passport, but because my dad was British, I could have, well, he was dual nationality or whatever. I could have a British passport. So in order to leave the country, leave Singapore, I had to change my nationality, because if not, I'd have to put down a huge lump sum deposit because of national service, like you're saying. So that when I had to come back, do national service, and they give me back the money, right? So to avoid all that, we just said, right, I'm just going to become British, gave back my Singapore passport, became British, and I said, right, seeing as I'm British, I will go to England at one point. I feel they're my roots, right? Actually, when I remember in Singapore, I felt more European than Chinese, right? I'd go to Catholic high school, be only with Chinese boys, but I'd be speaking English all the time. All my friends at home, my neighbours, they were all Australians, Swedish,
right.
and
so
all.
You hung out with the expat crowd.
Right, yeah. And so I felt kind of like a pull to England, but I didn't want to go there straight away because I knew I'd be going there. So I wanted more. I wanted to see France as well. And so this thing about learning French and all the rest, no problem. So I learned French. Well, I took 2 months or something at the Alliance Française in Singapore. I'd go to evening classes there for about 2 months, and then we went to France. So I spoke a bit of I don't know what, pidgin French, and then they put me in a holiday camp for 6 weeks with just French children at 12. All right, and after about 6 weeks, I spoke pretty much fluent French. So I lived in France with my parents.
And then you spent some time in the UK?
Yeah, so after about 4 years in France, right, I'd kind of grown up from being this 12-year-old to 16-year-old. I got into, adolescence in France, learning about French kissing and going out with girls and all that kind of stuff, learning how to be a big boy in France. I decided to go, why did that happen? I don't know, really. It just, at the end of the high school or whatever you call it.
Hitchhiking or something? Did you go traveling?
When I was in France, no. When I was in France, I was very much your normal French kid, basically. Well, I looked different, of course, but made loads of friends. Because I remember coming from Singapore, I had a Casio watch, right, with a calculator on it, and this for all the French kids in the middle of the countryside, right? This was like Star Trek. This was better than Star Trek, right? And so as soon as I came into the la cour de récréation, which is like the rest period, where you play football or basketball, ping pong or whatever, there'd be huge crowds of kids around me trying to look at my Casio watch, right?
Asian technology.
Alien technology, right? And they just thought I was fantastic, come from another planet, and all the rest of it. So I made loads of friends, got into that big time, and kind of did all right. Did pretty good at school. For example, in French class, I was like la moyenne. I was like average, right? There were guys worse than me in French class, right? So school was okay. And then at the end of high school, I decided now was time to go to this boarding school in England, right? Mm-hmm. Start wearing the ties, the school uniform. Okay. Well, which was actually in Singapore. I remember there was a kind of a school uniform as well.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about drugs?
Drugs. So how did that happen? Right, drugs. Now the thing is, right, seeing as I was in France, I'd kind of learned to be a bit of a bad boy, slightly a bad boy, not too much, but we'd be like, unfortunately, like at the age of like 15, 16, so smoking cigarettes and there might have been a little bit of pot at that time, I'm not sure, but I know that there were friends of mine who were really dodgy, right? We were only 16 or whatever, 15, and they were like, I think they were sniffing glue and stuff like that, and I wasn't actually doing that, but I was in that kind of crowd, right? And so when I went to England, this boarding school, this was really kind of, for me, it was like really tight ass, tie up to here, girls in separate dormitories or whatever. This is Cranley School, yeah, in Surrey. Or is it Sussex? Surrey, I think it was. And no smoking, very rigid, strict rules. I think caning had only just stopped right at that point when I got there. In fact, caning was probably still allowed in public schools, in private schools. And everything was very strict, very regulated. And I kind of basically slipped into a kind of a rebel type of attitude, I wasn't rebelling out of anger or anything like that. But I mean, it was teenage years. I remember, those were the times where you started shouting at your mum and saying nasty things to your mother and stuff like that. So it was good that I left home and all.
How did your mother and your father meet again?
He was a racing driver. She was a nurse. And they met on the racing tracks, right? She was the friend.
Was racing in
Singapore, yeah,
Singapore?
the Formula One Grand Prix of Singapore, and
Wow.
they'd make their own cars, right? They'd get the bits sent over from England, and they'd build their own cars out of it. And he had loads of trophies and stuff that you had to polish every so often, and all the rest of it.
Fascinating.
Very romantic, yeah.
So back to.
Yeah. So I was in Cranley, and I don't know what it was really. I just vaguely got into this idea that the way to be, the best way to be, basically, was like Jack Kerouac, was like Jim Morrison, was like Janis Joplin, was like Allen Ginsberg, who were pushing the envelope back in the 70s, right? By pushing the envelope of society, basically. The idea of freedom seemed very important to me, and freedom, for my mind, my adolescent mind at that point, had a lot to do with these people, these kind of, what were they, hippies, beatniks, the inventors of the hippie movement, basically. These guys were in the 50s and 60s.
Sure.
Poetry was their main thing. They were into Walt Whitman and stuff, and they would like take loads of drugs, write poetry, go on the road, visit, live off just love and life, hitchhiking, putting your thumb out to move around, opening your hands up to get money or food, just living from the bounty that was already there, because they were in America, right? America was the richest country at the time, still is.
Sure.
So there was so much bounty around that this thing was just to live freely like that. And there was a lot of, unfortunately, or fortunately, what was that other guy, Timothy Leary, who kind of thought that by taking LSD you could break through your mental barriers and see a fuller life, basically. Mm-hmm. So all this kind of stuff was in me, and I thought, poetry, taking drugs, rock and roll, pushing barriers, which I suppose isn't that strange didn't seem that strange to me at the time. Seemed kind of vaguely normal. I might have been pushing it slightly more than most folk, but my age. But when you are that age, and when the hippie period, the 70s, had already been and gone, it kind of seemed natural, And even now, what are we now in year 2000? It's become pretty much mainstream. I'm not saying it's good, but for example, all these kids, we're back in the countryside now. We're, in France. Kids in the countryside here, 17-year-old kids, in Lot-et-Garonne, where we are now. All of them have smoked pot. Like 70% are smoking pot regularly. Mm-hmm. This is bad for their mental development or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I was doing the same probably. but it's kind of become mainstream, you know, to live in trucks, to live in a tent, to live in a teepee. This is happening all over the place now. It's kind of become vaguely normal.
Let's come back to you, I guess, because we can go so many directions with this. And maybe we want to flesh out a little bit of, like, I guess, recovery. You know, like, what was that process like? I mean, you're pretty serious into it, right? You telling me that you were hiding in your garden.
Ah, right. Yes.
Time.
So yeah, okay. So I was at the school, getting vaguely into drugs and being a rowdy teenager, basically. Mm-hmm. The change kind of happened when I went to university. Right. When I went to university, it was just more of the same, basically. I became a vegetarian. I started traveling a lot, right? We'd go, like, one of the main places. Well, we went to Morocco, hitchhiked to Morocco, which was quite a struggle, actually. But also the main thing was India. Going to India was like a bit like, reminded me of LSD, actually, but there was no drugs involved, of course. And I also started squatting, which is basically finding a house that no one's using, and it's usually a rundown house. You can tell because the windows are all boarded up or whatever. Okay. And we did this because we had no money, right? Because we were like students with no money.
UK,
huh?
It's still done in the UK.
Yeah, apparently it's getting harder and harder. But anyway, at the time, you just find the house which is all boarded up, find a way to get in there, and once you were inside and put a new lock on the door, it was yours. No one could throw you out, right? Unless they could, they could throw you out by going to court and saying, "I want to use the house. It's my house," and so then you'd have to leave. But that's kind of a long process, you know. We could be in the house easily for like 6 months, you know. And so I started living with a bunch of artists,
like
travelers. I'm probably around about 20 years old, 17, 18, 19, 20. This lasted about 6 years, 6 or 7 years, where there was basically just more and more drugs, more and more partying. Partying became a way of life, right? The attitude at the time, this was like, they called it the summer of love, and then there'd be another summer of love, which was basically the rave scene. And so from just smoking a bit of dope and cigarettes, what have you, and drinking a few cans of beer, it would be suddenly we were into this scene, the rave scene, would push the other barrier as far as it would go: poetry, art, you know, painting, sculpture, living living our life as if our life was a kind of an art form. You know, I would change our house. When we move into a house, we'd kind of like sculpt it, change it from the outside, inside. You could see that something creative was happening here. Mm-hmm. Seemed important. And then we got into this rave scene, which was like every weekend you'd be out for 3 or 4 days in the countryside somewhere. We'd take over a field, or we'd take over an abandoned factory in town, in the city somewhere, and we'd like party for 3 or 4 days. And we'd just live there. I don't know how we did it now. It was all mainly drug-fueled, right? It was all, this music would be going all the time. Boom, boom, boom. And we'd be taking like LSD, we'd be taking like ecstasy. So there was basically too much drugs. Too much drugs. But I did want to say one thing about LSD, though. And these drugs, all of these drugs. They're all, for example, I was saying that for a young person to be smoking dope every day or regularly is gonna slow down their mental development, right? The IQ of the average French person now, I think, is going to start going down. It has been going up in the world, right? Since the 80s, the IQ of people my age, your age, is always been going up, right? From their parents. Mm-hmm. The IQ has been rising, and I'm thinking now, looking at the scene here, that it's probably going to slow down a bit, right? Because of the mental development. When you're smoking drugs, taking drugs, whatever, it's going to slow you down. But on the other hand, THC from dope does kind of make your imagination, free up your imagination. And sometimes you can even get to stages where you think you can understood quite deep philosophical concepts. Because when you've been smoking, it frees up your imagination and your understanding. It frees your mind up to understand things. But I'm not. You probably will have forgotten it in the next a few days. Unfortunately, it's quite doesn't last long. And then LSD, acid, right, which Timothy Leary was talking about. You take that, or magic mushrooms, which is kind of same thing. That also frees up your senses. Suddenly things seem alive, colors seem brighter, your normal barriers of understanding do fall apart, and you see things differently, right? So this is a mental work that is happening, right? And then there's the other one that they took a lot of, which was ecstasy, which basically means love. Suddenly there is no duality is gone. There is no enemy, there is no friend, no enemy. Everything is just love. You just love everything. Everything's great. You want to hug people. You want to be. We're just one big happy family, right? So and this is freeing up your heart, right? But unfortunately, of course, the next day you're not feeling good. It closes down. But they are doing things to you. There is a karma involved. But unfortunately, with all these things, with vitamin C or with too much orange juice, too much of anything is gonna have a bad effect. And drugs is strong stuff. So I took too much for too long. Right? This lasted for about 6 years, and I had a mental breakdown. I remember it was at a rave somewhere in the countryside, and I had to at some point I don't know what it was, somebody had given me something, and I felt basically I lost it. I became completely paranoid. Everything that I heard, it was actually the opposite of ecstasy, right? The opposite of love. Everything was fear. Fear. But there's two sides to everything, because even the THC from smoking dope, you get a bit of paranoia. And here I was in full blown. It was a mental psychosis. You could have put me in hospital, right?
Wow. Must have been pretty scary.
It was. I was 100% scared. Basically, every sound I heard was about me. People were talking about me. They're talking about my mother. In fact, or they're talking. It was all about me, and it was all bad. I was scared. I remember when we came back. We had a house at that point that I was renting at that point. Selling drugs, growing drugs in it, and selling drugs. I was living drugs 100%. It was too much. So I remember I lived in the bottom of my garden in the little tool shed for about 2 weeks, and my people sharing the house would come out and go, "Doug, are you all right, man?" And what saved me basically was that they weren't afraid of me, right? So they didn't have to call up anyone to take me away, right? I wasn't a scary mad person. I was just, very timid. I was like a little mouse hiding in the corner. So they were my friends. They weren't afraid of me. So they just kind of vaguely must have looked after me a little bit. And actually, at this point, in the middle of this, I don't know if this is going to be of any interest to anyone, but at that point, that was the first time I actually found a calm center in my life. And looking back at it, it felt like the eye of the hurricane. There was this mental kind of whirling going around. Everything I saw through my psychosis, right? And at the same time, all these things were flying past me, like a whirlwind. I found at that point a very, very calm spot. A very, very calm spot where the person watching, I was watching, and this person watching was very, very calm and had no judgment of all this. He just looked at it and he went, "Wow, this is really, you've really lost it."
Because you put it to the extreme.
The extreme. In this storm, the calm seemed so apparent. And that was the first time, I think.
Must have been as a spiritual experience.
It was a spiritual experience. It was seeing the center that never moves. And I didn't do it through any meditation. I never meditated at that point. I've been a bad boy all my life, right? And I was in total suffering. I don't think you could have suffered any more than that. I was in total suffering. There was nothing else apart from suffering. And in that point, I was able to see, because the difference was so great that it seemed so obvious, this little spot of calm that didn't change no matter what was going on. Mm-hmm. There was no training, the only slight training there was no training. My dad was a bit interested in mysticism or whatever you want to call it. But that was the only thing, really. But me, I'd just been a bad boy all my life.
So then did you check out like things like Narcotics Anonymous?
No, no, because I mean, I knew what I was doing really somewhere along the line. We know what's going on, you know. We know that drugs are bad. We know that cigarettes are bad. We know that drinking too much is bad. We know that it's all bad, right? So I knew what was going on, that it was to do with the drugs. And I decided that I couldn't live this life anymore. So I had a bit of money, so I bought a ticket to Puerto Rico. And I went and lived on the beach there for about 2 months in a little hotel by the beach. And I thought I'd learn how to surf, you know. So it was more like fresh air and, you know, whales, turtles, and coconut trees.
What did your parents think of all of this?
They didn't know what was happening at this point, right? They'd kind of noticed in the past that I'd been a bad boy, got chucked out of school and stuff for smoking, drinking, and chasing girls and stuff, which you're not allowed to do in boarding school. But they didn't know it had got to this point. And after Puerto Rico, I came back, stayed with my parents down in the farm. You know, this was the opposite of London. Didn't hardly know anyone out there, so I couldn't get any drugs. And then I was happy with that. So they of course, they noticed that you know, I had been through something quite tiring. I was a tired wreck when I came back to France.
Mm. And then,
but I didn't take any. One thing that saved me as well is that I didn't go to the psycho hospital. I wasn't filled full of other pills, different drugs, right? So I was able to stay with my problem,
sure,
and to deal with it and get through it through time and acceptance. My parents were very accepting, right?
Mm. And then you met your French wife. Is that fast forwarding?
No, that was about it. I still kind of course, you know, in France I got in with the hippies again. They were my family, you know. Well, I'm not talking about my mum and my dad. My emotional family were hippies, so you always get.
Let me check the camera. 1 sec.
Go on.
Shit. You know, I think it's going to be an audio interview.
Right.
Alright, we carry on with audio.
So got in with the hippies again, right? As usual, they were my emotional family, and so there was still a bit of THC around, a bit of dope, and of course I was still quite young, so I was interested in girls, and so girls, what have you, and got this girl pregnant.
She was about your age?
She was about 10 years younger than me, probably, or something like that. I was about 28, 29, 30. I was probably say I was about 30, 31 when I became a dad. And she'd already had another child. So I was kind of already a stepdad when we were living together. On this, I had this little kind of ruin that we were doing up, and so yeah, I became a dad. And it was pretty crazy, really, because I only just had about 3 years to get over my madness, to come a little bit back down to earth, get calmed down or what have you, and I was a dad. Don't know what to say about that. That's a very big thing as well, a huge thing. So we get into basically. This is the life of billions of people on this planet. Actually, we're on this planet, we're suffering, and we're looking for relief. Right? We're looking for pleasure. We're looking for happiness. And so I knew I was suffering, right? I mean, I had my problems of paranoia, a slight paranoia. It was nothing to do with the psychosis I had before, but it was still there slightly. So I knew I was suffering, and one of the things I'd kind of decided in my mind is I wanted a beautiful girl, a beautiful woman in my life would make me happy, you see? Because I'd been out with a very intelligent woman before, and that had lasted a long time. It was a very good experience. But now I decided that happiness was with a beautiful woman. So I found this beautiful woman, but she was mad. She was beautiful, but she didn't have any. Her mind wasn't so beautiful. And so I was kind of vaguely living. I was living with this woman. She was like man and wife, and we had a child. And I loved her. I decided that this was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. But suddenly, when the child came, I suddenly grew up. I don't know what happened, but there was a turning around in my way of seeing things. My paradigm, my worldview changed, right? Suddenly I was a dad, and although I didn't want to be a dad, I was. And I decided, well, it was decided for me, I decided that I was going to be the best dad I could be. That was the only thing, my way forward in life was to be whatever I was going to be, but do it and do my best. And unfortunately, that meant having to, as far as I could understand, separate from my wife, because I couldn't look after her and the child, because she was a bit like a child, really. And there you go. So at this point...
Well, having a kid must have been something that you chose to, I guess, ground yourself a little bit.
Well, this was very unconscious, because consciously I've always been against having a child. I want freedom to live my life as I see fit, right? To go explore all the frontiers that I can, right? And a child is not, as far as I knew, wasn't that. A child was responsibility. A child was me no longer being the most important person. And the child was looking after someone else and not looking after me anymore. But I learned another lesson here, slowly. Of course, it didn't come straight away. But now looking back, I've been a dad now, 11 years, 10 years, and looking back, in fact, there's a lesson there. There's a big lesson there. Doing what you have to do, no longer. Somehow, the fact of responsibility is I don't know. There's something's happened. I can't quite explain it. But I'd like to talk about another thing. It's like jogging. Jogging, right, is something that I hated all my life. It's running, right? Running, getting tired, struggling to run, running out of breath, feeling a pain, a kind of physical and mental pain of having to keep going. And it's something that I always avoided as much as possible, right? I didn't mind sports, but as long as there was a reason, right? Like putting a ball in a basket or something like that, God knows. But jogging seemed completely... with no point whatsoever, right? Just suffering. But now, you get a pleasure out of it. You get a fulfillment out of it. Jogging, there's some, I don't know. I'm trying to explain. Don't know what. Sometimes, the thing that you're running away from, in fact, is what you need. And sometimes a struggle. Well, it's obvious, really. A struggle is what makes you stronger. And you become a stronger person, basically. And somehow not thinking about yourself and your own pleasure all the time frees you up to experience pleasure that's there all the time.
So what do you do now for...
Well, now I'm a parent. I have been a full-time single parent for 10 years. And I've been doing that pretty much. That's my main thing that I do. Really, I also made money by renting out rooms in my house, right, which is a holiday house for English tourists. It was like a swimming pool and rooms and stuff, and they would take the whole house, and I'd go and live in this. I made myself a cave. I dug a little hole in the hillside behind my farm, and lived in a hole, lived in a cave basically with my son, which was kind of like an experiment in alternative living. But anyway, that'll take too long to explain.
Yeah. Doug, thank you so much for being with us. Any kind of last things you'd like to mention to our listeners?
Well, live your life as you see, wherever life brings you. Wherever you want to go, that's where you should go. And life is there to be lived to the fullest. It always has been. When we were digging for weeds or whatever, roots in the ground, till now there's millions of dollars all over the place flying around, there's no need to fear. Just live life to the fullest.
Thank you.
Thank you.